They say a storm doesn't always begin with thunder. Sometimes, it begins with silence. That night, my house was too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes your chest heavy, like even the walls are holding their breath. A single envelope sat on the dining table. My name, his handwriting. I knew before opening it that my life would split in two, the before and the after. Inside was a single page, a divorce notice. And below it, Daniel's signature, clean, confident, final. No explanation. No apology. No goodbye. Just a note beside it that read, "You'll manage, Sarah." That was it. 10 years of love, gone in 10 letters. I didn't cry at first. I just stood there, staring at the words until they blurred into nothing. And then, it hit me. The laughter that used to fill this house, gone. The photos on the wall, any lies. The man I built a future with, a stranger. I picked up my phone and called him. Once, twice, 10 times. No answer, only that same robotic voice. "You've reached Daniel. Leave a message." But what do you say to a man who erased you like a mistake? Why? Please? No, he didn't deserve a question. He deserved the silence he left behind. By midnight, I was sitting in my car, barefoot, broken, and surrounded by everything that didn't fit into one suitcase. The rain came down hard, beating against the windshield like it wanted me to scream. But I didn't. Instead, I just stared at my reflection in the glass. A woman I barely recognized. I used to think love made you softer, but in that moment, I realized something brutal. Love also makes you blind. And when it leaves, you see everything you refused to before. The signs, the cold tone, the distance. He'd been planning this for months. While I cooked his dinners, he was moving our money. While I trusted him, he was rewriting our story, with me cut out of the ending. He didn't just break my heart. He dismantled my life piece by piece. The house? Sold. The bank account? Drained. The company shares we invested in together? Transferred to his name. And me? Just a woman with a car full of clothes and a heart full of rage. By dawn, the rain had stopped, but I hadn't moved. The world outside went on like nothing happened. People rushing to work. Neighbors walking their dogs. And there I was, invisible. That's when it sank in. No one was coming to save me. Not friends. Not family, not him. If I wanted to survive this, I'd have to become someone new. So I started the engine, took one last look at the house that used to be my dream, and whispered under my breath, "You'll regret this, Daniel." The night everything fell apart wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was the rebirth of a woman who had nothing left to lose. And a woman with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous kind of storm. I used to think losing a home meant losing walls. But I learned the truth. You don't lose a place. You lose belonging. The first night after Daniel left, I parked behind a closed gas station. The rain had stopped, but the world still felt wet, like everything was soaked in sorrow. The leather seat became my pillow. The back seat, my closet. My car, my only proof that I existed somewhere. At first, I told myself it was temporary. A few nights. A pause before I'd figure things out. But pauses can stretch into weeks. And weeks into silence. Soon, the numbers in my account fell faster than I could count. Food became math. Can I afford this sandwich? Will this coffee last till tomorrow? I started showering at public gyms, brushing my teeth in gas station bathrooms. And when the attendants looked at me too long, I'd smile, pretending I still had somewhere to go. Every night I parked in a new spot. Church parking lots felt the safest. But even there, peace was fragile. Every sound made me flinch. A knock, a shadow, the thought of someone seeing me like this. The woman I used to be, with manicured nails, silk sheets, and dinner reservations, was gone. In her place stood someone raw, someone unpolished, someone who learned that pride doesn't fill an empty stomach. One morning, I woke up to sunlight flooding through the window. For a second, I forgot where I was. Then the smell hit me, gasoline and old air freshener. That's when I broke. Not because I was hungry. Not because I was tired. But because I realized no one even noticed I was missing. Friends stopped calling. Family assumed I was figuring things out. Daniel had blocked me everywhere. It was like I'd been erased, a ghost wandering through a city that once knew my name. That's when I found her, a woman named Lila at a church kitchen. She didn't ask what happened. She just handed me soup and said, "Eat first. Stories come later." That bowl of soup tasted like hope. It reminded me I was still human, not just surviving, but still capable of rebuilding. She introduced me to a women's shelter downtown, a place that didn't ask for explanations, just names and courage. The first night there, I slept on a cot beside 10 strangers. The air was heavy with loss, but somehow, also strength. Everyone had their own version of my story. Different names, same pain. We were broken women, but together, we became each other's mirrors. Proof that survival wasn't shameful. It was sacred. Days turned into routines. Folding blankets. Volunteering in the kitchen. Searching job boards that rarely called back. And through all that, I learned something powerful. You can lose everything, but as long as you wake up willing to fight, you're not defeated. The shelter wasn't my rock bottom. It was my rebirth, because sometimes you have to lose your world to find your worth. It was a Tuesday morning, gray sky, thin rain, same routine. I was folding donated clothes at the shelter, stacking shirts that didn't fit anyone anymore, when the door opened. I didn't notice him at first. Men rarely came here, and when they did, it was usually to drop off boxes or paperwork. But this one stood still, his umbrella dripping, eyes scanning the room like he was searching for something that wasn't there. He looked out of place, too polished for this world. A navy coat, leather shoes that had never met puddles, and a folder clutched in his hand like it held all the answers. Lila went up to greet him. They spoke quietly, her eyes flicking toward me every few seconds. I felt that uneasy heat you get when someone's talking about you but you don't know why. Then she called my name. "Sarah, honey, can you come here for a minute?" I wiped my hands on my jeans, half expecting her to ask me to move a box or sign something. But the man's eyes followed me, steady, almost too kind, like he already knew me. "Are you Sarah Walker?" he asked. The way he said it, careful, deliberate, made my chest tighten. It wasn't just a question. It sounded like the beginning of something. "Yes," I said slowly. "Why?" He opened the folder. Inside were papers, crisp, official, heavy. A logo I didn't recognize. And then a photograph. Of me. My heart skipped. No one had taken my picture in months. "I've been trying to find you for weeks," he said. "My name's Ethan Moore. I represent the law firm of Hamilton and Reed." My mind went blank. Law firm? Me? I thought maybe Daniel had filed something else. Or worse, I'd somehow broken a rule at the shelter. "This might sound strange," he continued, "but are you related to Margaret Lane?" That name hit me like thunder. Margaret Lane, my mother's sister. The one who'd left for Europe years ago. We'd lost contact after the divorce tore everything apart. "She passed away 3 months ago," he said softly. "And she named you in her will." The room seemed to shrink. The hum of the fluorescent light grew louder. For a second, I forgot to breathe. "I think there's been a mistake," I whispered. I haven't spoken to her in years. But Ethan just smiled. A patient smile, the kind people use when they're about to change your life. "There's no mistake, Ms. Walker. She left everything to you. Her estate, her accounts, her shares." He paused, eyes steady on mine. "You've just inherited $67 million. The words didn't register. They just floated in the air between us, impossible, ridiculous, cruel even. Me, a woman sleeping on a cot with a donated blanket, the heir to a fortune." Lila's hand found my shoulder. "Sarah, breathe," she whispered. And I did. But it felt like inhaling someone else's dream. The rest was a blur. Signatures, confirmations, Ethan's calm voice explaining logistics. But I only caught fragments. Private account. Transfer pending. Legal verification. I wasn't hearing him. All I could think about was the irony. How the world waits until you have nothing to remind you of what was yours all along. When he left, I sat by the window. The rain had stopped. And for the first time in months, I didn't feel small. I felt seen. But somewhere deep down, a voice whispered, "Why now? Why me? And what will this money really change?" Because I'd already learned once, blessings often come wrapped in storms. That night, sleep didn't come easy. Even after Ethan's visit, even after those words, $67 million, my mind couldn't hold still. It felt unreal, like someone had handed a fairy tale to a woman who'd forgotten what dreams felt like. The shelter lights went out at 10, but I lay there staring at the cracked ceiling, listening to the quiet breathing of people who, like me, had lost almost everything. At midnight, the door creaked. Lila whispered, "You awake?" I nodded. She handed me a small envelope. "He left this for you," she said. Said it might explain things. My fingers trembled as I turned it over. The paper was thick and expensive. My name was written in elegant cursive ink, Sarah Walker. Inside was a single folded letter and a photograph. Me as a little girl, laughing beside a woman with kind eyes and soft gray hair. Aunt Margaret. I hadn't seen that picture in decades. I unfolded the letter slowly. Each line felt heavier than the last. "My dearest Sarah, if you are reading this, it means I am gone. I wish we'd spoken sooner. I wish I'd been there when you needed family the most. When your mother passed, I wanted to reach out, but your husband made it impossible. He told me you didn't want contact, that you were moving on, and didn't need us anymore. I believed him, and that was my greatest mistake. I have no children of my own, Sarah. No one else carries our family's name or memories. I spent years searching for you after the divorce, until I finally learned where you were. By then you had lost everything and because of lies. So I decided that when I was gone, I would give you back what life stole from you. Not just wealth, but the power to stand again. My estate, all $67 million of it, belongs to you. Use it not for revenge, but for rebuilding. Yet I know you, my niece. You'll find your own way to justice. Remember this, money reveals who people truly are. Some will love you for it. Others will return pretending they never left. Watch closely. And when the truth comes, don't run from it. With all my love, Margaret Lane, I read it again and again, each word cutting deeper than the last. He told her I didn't want contact? Daniel, the man I once called my husband, had erased me from my own family. I pressed the letter to my chest, a storm of anger and disbelief tightening in my throat. All those years I thought I was unwanted, that no one cared where I'd gone after the divorce. And all along, it was his doing. He'd stolen more than my marriage. He'd stolen my chance at family. The next morning, Ethan returned, his tone calm, professional. But when he saw my face, he paused. He must have known I'd read the letter. "I know it's a lot to take in," he said softly. "Your aunt was a remarkable woman. She left you not just money but instructions, how she wanted it handled." He handed me another document, a thick binder with legal seals and banking details. My name was printed at the top, right beside the figure I'd thought I'd misheard before, $67,000. Wow, even seeing it didn't make it real. I ran my fingers over the numbers, half expecting them to fade like chalk on a wall. "It's all verified," Ethan continued. "Her assets were liquidated and transferred into a trust under your name. The account is active." A part of me wanted to cry. Another part wanted to scream. And somewhere, buried deep inside, was the part that wanted justice. Not for the money, but for every night I'd gone hungry because someone decided I didn't deserve better. I thought about Daniel, how cold his eyes had been when he'd handed me those divorce papers, how quickly he'd replaced me, how easily he'd convinced the world that I was the one who'd fallen apart. And now fate had turned. I wasn't the broken one anymore. I was the woman with 67 million reasons to come back, not to beg, but to show him exactly what he'd thrown away. As I folded the letter and placed it back into its envelope, I whispered to Aunt Margaret's memory, "You gave me back more than money. You gave me the truth, and now I'll decide what to do with it." Outside, the morning light spilled through the cracked windows of the shelter. It wasn't warmth I felt this time. It was resolve. Because when the truth finally finds you, it doesn't just heal you. It arms you. They say when life gives you power after pain, the first thing you feel isn't joy. It's fear. Because deep down, you know power changes everything, and once you taste it, you'll never be the same again. When I left the shelter that morning, I didn't tell anyone where I was going. Not Lila, not Ethan, no one. I packed the only things I owned, a few clothes, my aunt's letter, and a single photograph, and I disappeared. No goodbyes. No explanations. Just silence. I checked into a small motel on the edge of town. Cash only, no ID. The room smelled of dust and old wallpaper, but it was mine. For the first time in years, I turned the key, locked the door, and felt safe enough to breathe. That night, I sat by the window with my aunt's letter on my lap, reading it again under the yellow light. The words seemed different now, heavier, clearer. She hadn't just left me money. She'd left me a mission. Use it not for revenge, but for rebuilding, she had written. But deep down, I knew rebuilding and revenge could sometimes mean the same thing, because I wasn't the same woman Daniel had left behind. He'd taken everything from me, my home, my dignity, my family's connection, and now I had a chance to rebuild every piece he'd broken. But not loudly. Not with noise. Quietly. Silently. Like a storm forming beyond the horizon. I started small. I rented a modest apartment in a quiet neighborhood under a new name, Grace Lane. It felt poetic, my aunt's surname carrying me forward. Every morning I studied. Not gossip magazines or romance novels, but finance, business, investment, psychology. I devoured books about negotiation and emotional control because I knew money without wisdom was just another trap. I hired no assistants, no managers. Everything went through a private account Ethan helped me set up, a clean slate, invisible to everyone from my past. And slowly, the woman who'd once slept in shelters began to disappear. Her posture straightened. Her voice grew steadier. Her fear started to fade. But the memory of Daniel never left. It lived quietly in the back of my mind, a shadow whispering, "You'll never be enough." So I kept building. Not to prove him wrong, but to remind myself that I could exist without his version of me. One night, months later, I stood in front of the mirror. The reflection staring back didn't look like Sarah Walker anymore. Gone was the woman who flinched at her own name. In her place stood someone calm, deliberate. A woman who knew things now. I'd learned the language of power. I'd learned patience, the kind that hurts. And most importantly, I'd learned that silence is the loudest weapon you can ever use. So I stayed quiet. While Daniel flaunted his new life online, his new wife, his business ventures, his public smile, I watched. Not with bitterness, with strategy. Every post, every update, every lie was a clue, and I collected them like chess pieces. In the evenings, I'd walk to a small cafe near the harbor, the kind where no one asks questions. I'd sit with a notebook, sipping black coffee, writing in the same pattern every time. Step 1, observe. Step 2, learn. Step 3, wait. Step 4, strike. But only when silence turns into an opportunity. I wasn't chasing revenge anymore. I was preparing for justice, the kind that doesn't destroy people's bodies but breaks their illusions. And deep down I knew the moment would come. The moment when Daniel would realize the woman he'd buried was standing right behind him, stronger, smarter, and untouchable. But before that day arrived, I had one promise to keep, to myself, and to Aunt Margaret's letter. I had to become someone even I didn't recognize. A version of me that could walk back into his world not as the ex-wife he pitied, but as the mystery he feared. So I built, I learned, I vanished. And while the world forgot me, I quietly remembered everything. Because sometimes, the most dangerous comeback isn't made with noise. It's made with silence and a smile that says, "You have no idea what's coming." Revenge, I decided, would not be loud. It would not be a scene on a street with accusations and broken glass. That kind of spectacle feeds tabloids and leaves you hollow. What I wanted was different. I wanted him to watch his carefully built lie unravel, piece by piece, and feel every stitch come loose before his eyes. I wanted truth to do the work for me. So I wrote the rules for my plan, The way a surgeon writes notes before an operation. Clear, deliberate, and without emotion getting in the way. Rule 1. Expose, don't annihilate. Rule 2. Let others see the truth and decide for themselves. Rule 3. Timing is everything. First, I learned my opponent. Not just Daniel the ex-husband, but Daniel the public persona. He was a man of impressions, liking the right posts, smiling for the right cameras, cultivating a network that depended on his polished image. People admired him because he looked admired. That image was a web, and every web has a center that, if touched, causes everything around it to tremble. So I built my tools. Tool 1, information. I hired private investigators under different names, of course, to gather facts that his social circle would either forget or hide. The shell companies. The rushed transfers, the quiet changes in corporate paperwork. Not illegal digging, just old-fashioned diligence. Public records, corporate registries, property filings, and a few friendly accountants who knew how to read between the lines. Money has handwriting. Once you know how to read it, secrets become loud. Tool 2, evidence that people could trust. A claim from me would mean little. A carefully assembled file of documents, timestamps, emails, and witness statements would speak louder than my voice. I needed proof that Daniel had not only taken my life, but had quietly rewritten the past to suit himself. Contracts with forged signatures, transfers made the day after our fight, texts where he lied about calls I never received, little threads that together formed a rope strong enough to pull his facade down. Tool 3, allies. No one survives a comeback alone. But allies for me weren't friends who cheered. They were people whose interests aligned with mine. Journalists who hated corruption. An editor at a local paper who had been burned by small-town PR before. A lawyer who believed in exposing truth because it cleaned a system that rewarded thieves. I approached them slowly, not as a victim pleading, but as someone with documents and deadlines. I learned how to pitch, concise, compelling, backed by proof. That made them listen. Tool 4, social engineering, subtle, humane, and surgical. I didn't want to humiliate him in a moment of chaos. I wanted the public to see the differences between who he claimed to be and who he actually was. So I planted small contradictions. Unpaid vendors quietly posting poor experiences. Former employees anonymously sharing how decisions were made. A charity he supported revealing delayed checks. Each small exposure was a chip removed from the marble statue of his public life. Tool 5, financial leverage. Money had been his strongest weapon against me. So I learned its language. I didn't plan to throw my wealth around. I planned to use it like a scalpel. Targeted, precise. I set up anonymous accounts to fund investigations, to secure data for journalists, and to quietly support whistleblowers who feared retaliation. I also began buying small holdings in businesses tied to him, not to take them over, but to watch, to gain shareholder access, and to attend meetings where his confidence might falter and statements would be recorded. Most important was the shape of the plan, slow, patient, and layered. The first layer was credibility. I needed to be seen not as a woman with an axe to grind, but as a credible source with documents and witnesses. So we scheduled small, verifiable releases. One vendor story here, one piece of financial paperwork there. Each release had its own proof, its own timestamp, and its own quiet echo in a forum or a local column. The second layer was pressure. Once a few cracks appeared, I'd increase the volume. A feature article, an investigative piece, a recorded deposition from someone who had once been close to him. This wasn't violence. It was exposure. I let truth make the case while the court of public opinion did its work. The third layer was personal. I wanted Daniel to feel it in his bones. Not because I wanted him destroyed, but because I wanted him to understand the price of erasing people. So I arranged situations where he would face consequences he couldn't buy his way out of, shareholders asking uncomfortable questions during quarterly calls, a charity withdrawing its endorsement after an unpaid pledge surfaced, a former friend testifying under oath about irregularities. It was not cruelty. It was accountability. At night, I rehearsed the plan the way an actor rehearses lines. I imagined his face when the first article went live. I imagined the tightness in his voice when asked why he'd listed our joint assets under his name. I imagined the slow realization that every small lie had been cataloged, time-stamped, and stacked against him. There was one part of the plan designed purely for my own justice, the reveal. Not a mob scene, not a cry on live TV. A private dinner with him invited, not publicly, but in a way he couldn't refuse, followed by a release that would make his choices impossible to misunderstand. I wanted him to look at me and see the woman he'd chosen to discard. I wanted him to see that I hadn't asked for pity or mercy. I had asked for truth. And I would have it. Throughout it all, I kept one rule close: never stoop to the cruelty of the ones who hurt me. There would be no blackmail, no traps, no illegal acts, not because I was naive, but because those tools change the user as much as the target. I wanted to be better than the man who left me on a dining table like trash. I wanted my victory to be clean. Planning was not just about logistics. It was about emotion control. I learned to keep my face blank when people tried to guilt me into silence. I learned to breathe when I read headlines that tried to twist the narrative. Revenge is easy when it's loud. Accountability is harder because it requires patience and restraint. The most unexpected ally in all of this was quiet. Silence allowed others to speak. Silence allowed documents to be examined without my voice clouding the facts. Silence made my moves invisible until they mattered. And so I waited. Not idly, but with purpose. I assembled proof, nurtured allies, and nudged the world gently, like someone setting a row of dominoes and then stepping back to watch. Each piece of evidence, each witness, each small public revelation was a domino. My hand would not strike the table until the pattern was perfect. When it finally unfolded, I wanted him to feel each fall. Not because I wanted him miserable, but because truth, when handled right, is a kind of justice that humbles the proud without corrupting the humbled. That was the revenge I wanted. Not to destroy a man, but to make him see the cost of being the kind of person who erases others to build himself. And as I closed my notebook and set my pen down, I felt a quiet peace. I had a plan. It was careful, cruel only in its honesty, and built on proof. This would not be about rage. It would be about righting wrongs. When the time came, the world would know the truth. And Daniel would finally understand the woman he had underestimated. Planting a garden takes patience. You don't fling seeds and expect roses the next morning. You prepare the soil. You pick the right seeds. You water them quietly. That's how I treated the first moves of my plan. Small, careful, nearly invisible, but always intentional. I started by changing the maps that led back to me. Not with lies or fake papers, with layers that protected my anonymity while I watched. A trust in my aunt's name became the primary gatekeeper for the funds. Public records showed nothing that screamed Sarah Walker. Ethan handled the legal shell like a surgeon. Proper filings, named trustees, clear instructions. Everything was above board because my weapon was truth, and truth does not need shadows to hide in. Then came the people. I didn't want cheerleaders. I wanted precise instruments, allies who could turn one document into a story that couldn't be ignored. There was Anna, an investigative journalist whose byline had made a few corrupt men uncomfortable. I found her through a quiet tip line at a regional paper and met her in a library cafe that smelled like old coffee and older newspapers. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I handed her a folder, neat, labeled, and terrifying in its quietness. "Read this," I said. "Decide if it's worth your time." She read. She didn't look up until the last page. "Show me your proof," she said. Not an accusation, proof. That was my cue. I let the documents sing for themselves. Bank transfers, time-stamped emails, and a few corroborating notes from people who'd been quietly hurt by the same man. Then there was James, a retired accountant who'd seen how small lies grew into large frauds in corporate ledgers. I found him through a community legal aid referral. He didn't care who I was. He cared about numbers that didn't add up. He spent nights cross-referencing public filings with the shady transfers the PIs had uncovered. He became obsessed in the way people become obsessed when they finally realize a small injustice has been allowed to stand for too long. I also needed legal muscle that moved without drama. Ethan introduced me to a lawyer who understood reputation, defamation, and the tightrope of exposing truth without falling into the trap of personal vendetta. We drafted subpoenas that would be ready when the time came, prepared affidavits from former employees who feared retaliation, and built a legal scaffold that could support the story Anna would write. While the people set the eyes and ears, I set the accounts, not to hide money, but to make sure resources were available where they would do the most good, for evidence, for investigations, and for supporting those who might risk everything to speak. I opened foundation-style accounts that could pay for legal fees and investigative work without creating headlines. Those accounts made it possible to compensate whistleblowers anonymously, to secure digital backups of documents, and to purchase access to archived records that would otherwise be costly and slow to retrieve. The seed planting also meant small, strategic purchases. I bought tiny stakes in companies where Daniel's name surfaced. Nothing to control, only enough to get shareholder notices, to request minutes, to attend annual meetings. A mole in a boardroom can be more revealing than 100 anonymous tips. From the back row at a meeting, I watched how he presented himself, watched what he omitted, and collected the moments when his careful script faltered. And then came the legal threads, not traps, but paths that, when pulled, revealed the structure beneath the facade. We traced signature dates against transfer dates. We matched contractor complaints with payment cutoffs. We noted patterns, the timing of transfers that coincided with arguments I now remembered, the businesses that appeared and disappeared like stage props. I planted vendor complaints, but in a way that kept things honest. People I'd met in the shelter, not as pawns but as witnesses, were coaxed into telling their truth about dealings with companies connected to him. Their stories were small at first: late payments, canceled contracts, promises that turned to silence. One by one, these petty injustices formed a pattern that would later show the world how business was done behind closed doors. Another piece of the plan was human. Reputations are social currencies. I quietly reached out to people Daniel had hurt who were still afraid to speak. Sometimes it was a long message. You matter. I have documents. I can protect sources. Sometimes it was as simple as a coffee and listening. Fear dissolves when someone believes you. Courage grows when people find they are not alone. Digital safety became its own religion. Every email I sent had layers of protection. Every file had backups in secure locations. I switched phones like costumes, used encrypted communication, and learned how to read a metadata trail well enough to avoid leaving one of my own. Not because I was hiding crimes, because I was protecting those who would risk their livelihoods by telling the truth. Patience was the hardest soil to tend. There were weeks when nothing happened. I would walk past the cafes where Anna filed her notes, watch the news for the right opening, and feel the itch to push too early. But the plan thrived on timing. A premature reveal could be dismissed as spite. A carefully staged sequence, however, would look like a chorus of truth. It was also important to seed doubt publicly but gently. A vendor's online review that mentioned an unpaid invoice. A former contractor quietly remarking in a private forum about an odd end to a gig. Small things that on their own looked like coincidence. Together, they would become a chorus. The chorus would then invite reporters to look closer. Reporters would find documents. Documents would lead to legal scrutiny, dominoes that moved only when each was placed just so, and behind each planted seed was a human hand, mine. I learned restraint. I mastered the art of the small gesture that felt accidental. I learned when to be visible and when to be a rumor that people collected like evidence. Sometimes at night, I would sit and list all the tiny moves on a napkin. People contacted, accounts opened, meetings scheduled, affidavits prepared. It read like a map. Every dot had a purpose. Every line would lead somewhere. My revenge was not about spectacle. It was about correcting a ledger where my life had been written down and crossed out. I wanted the world to read the ledger and understand that what looked like success on the surface had been built on small, cruel erasures. So I planted seeds, not to entrap, but to let truth grow in a place where lies once took root. When spring eventually comes, gardens don't ask who planted them. They simply bloom. And when the first tendrils of truth began to show, I knew the harvest was not far. It started quietly. No grand confrontations, no headlines yet, just ripples. Small ones, deliberate, but enough to disturb the calm surface Daniel thought he controlled. The first sign was a headline buried halfway down a business blog. Local construction firm under audit for mismanaged funds. His company's name wasn't even in the title, but it was there, mentioned in paragraph 3, a casual reference that no one outside the industry would notice. But Daniel would. He watched every mention, every quote, every potential threat to his spotless image. That article was Anna's first move. She called it a test drop. A breadcrumb. Let's see how fast he reacts, she'd said, sipping her coffee like a chess player who already knows how the match ends. He reacted in hours. His PR manager reached out to the blog demanding a correction. His lawyer issued a statement about baseless rumors. Exactly as expected. The louder he shouted, the more suspicious he looked. Then came the vendor stories. Tiny posts from small business owners who felt wronged years ago but never had a voice. A comment under a LinkedIn post. A Reddit thread about contractors who never pay on time. A whistleblower's anonymous tweet. Individually, they were whispers. Together, they sounded like a warning bell. The beauty was in the pacing. Each coincidental complaint appeared just days apart. Different sources, different platforms, yet all pointing to the same cracks. People began connecting dots that didn't even need my help to be connected. The internet, after all, has a perfect memory for hypocrisy. I remember the first time I saw Daniel's photo trending beneath a hashtag. Small, but visible. Were you builder of lies? I smiled, not with cruelty, but with a strange, calm satisfaction. The truth was stretching its wings. Then came the audit. A quiet inquiry launched by a regulatory office after one too many discrepancies appeared in the company's filings. The accountant, James, had guided Anna toward the precise numbers to highlight, not accusations, just questions that demanded answers. Questions Daniel couldn't easily answer without unraveling his careful fictions. When the audit became public, he did what arrogant men often do. He underestimated it. He laughed in interviews, called it a routine check. He said things like, "When you're successful, people want to tear you down." It sounded rehearsed, but his eyes betrayed him. Darting, defensive, not the calm confidence he once wore like armor. And then came the first real blow. One of his longtime investors, a quiet woman who'd stood by him for years, pulled out. No drama, no press release, just a brief statement that she was redirecting funds. Behind the scenes, she'd read the early reports and decided not to risk her name tied to his. That's when Daniel began calling people. Frantic, desperate, paranoid. Trying to control a fire he couldn't even see. His assistant leaked a voice message to a local reporter. "Find out who's feeding them this garbage. I'll end their career." That single clip became a spark. Proof that he was nervous. Once fear enters a man's voice, even power starts to sound hollow. Each week, another piece of his empire began to wobble. A subcontractor terminated their agreement, pending clarification. A journalist requested documents from City Hall. An old employee hinted in a podcast about toxic leadership and unpaid dues. These weren't attacks. They were echoes, the world beginning to notice what I had seen long ago. But my favorite moment, the one I still replay when I need to remember why patience matters, was a short exchange at a charity gala. He was there, of course, still clinging to appearances. A reporter asked him offhand, "Mr. Hale, care to comment on the investigation?" He smiled too wide, his voice a touch too sharp when he said, "What investigation?" A pause. Cameras clicked. That pause said everything. The empire hadn't fallen yet, not even close. But the foundation had cracked. And Daniel, for the first time in years, felt what I had once felt every night in that shelter: uncertainty. Except mine had built resilience. His was beginning to build fear. I didn't need explosions. I didn't need chaos. All I needed was time. Because every small win, Every whisper, every headline, every rumor backed by fact was a reminder that the truth doesn't shout. It waits, it builds. And then, when the timing is right, it speaks so loudly the world can't ignore it. The small wins weren't the end. They were the tremors before the quake, proof that even the mightiest towers can shake when the ground beneath them remembers who they buried. The day the mask cracked wasn't some cinematic explosion, it was a whisper, carried on a stage he thought he owned. Daniel had been invited to speak at a business summit downtown, a gathering of elite investors, journalists, and city officials. The kind of room that had always adored him. He walked in wearing his signature navy suit, that smug confidence stitched into every stride. Cameras flashed, applause followed. But this time the applause didn't sound like admiration. It sounded forced, shorter, uneasy. By then, too many whispers had spread. Too many dots had connected. The words audit, whistleblower, and financial misconduct had appeared together one too many times. And Daniel's charm, that silver-tongued act that once fooled everyone, now looked like denial dressed in arrogance. Still, he smiled. Still, he spoke. Still, he lied. I watched it all from a distance, streaming live, sitting in a quiet cafe just a few blocks away. My coffee had gone cold, untouched. His speech began like all the others, the hero story of a self-made man who built his empire with integrity. Integrity. That word hit me like a slap. But then, something unexpected happened. In the middle of his talk, one of his so-called friends, a business partner named Victor, stood up. The cameras turned. Victor's voice didn't tremble when he said, "Daniel, are you still pretending nothing's wrong? You've been lying to everyone. To us." Gasps filled the room. Daniel froze, hands tightening around the podium. His smile faltered for the first time in public. Victor continued, voice rising. "You shifted project funds into personal accounts. You forged signatures. You left people bankrupt while you bought yourself another mansion." The moderator tried to cut the mic, but it was too late. Reporters were already recording, phones lifted like weapons of truth. Daniel tried to laugh it off, but the sound came out cracked, unconvincing. "Victor, you know that's nonsense." "We talked about this." "Yes," Victor interrupted. "And you promised to fix it. But you didn't. You lied again." That was the moment. The one that turned murmurs into proof. The one that made every quiet rumor roar into a headline. Within hours, the clip went viral. Millions watched the man who once seemed untouchable stand on that stage, cornered, sweating, his voice breaking. But here's the cruel part. Victor wasn't a hero. He was never on my side. He wasn't exposing Daniel for justice. He was doing it to save himself. Later, I learned Victor had his own skeletons, tied tightly to Daniel's empire. He thought if he betrayed first, he'd come out clean. Cowardice wearing the mask of courage. I'd seen that look before. Still, his betrayal served my purpose. One by one, Daniel's allies turned on him, each friend stepping away, each partner issuing carefully worded statements like, "We were unaware of any wrongdoing." They didn't even wait for the investigation to finish. They could smell decay. The next confrontation came not in a hall, but in a live interview. Daniel sat across from a journalist known for tearing egos apart with polite smiles. She leaned forward and asked, "Mr. Hale, is it true your ex-wife once worked for you, and that she was left with nothing after the divorce?" Silence. His lips parted, but no words came. He tried to pivot, but the journalist pressed harder. "People say she was homeless after you cut her off. That you sold the house and took every account in your name. Any truth to that?" I didn't need to see the rest. I closed my laptop, because in that moment, when he realized the world now saw me, I'd already won. The truth was out. Not through rage. Not through revenge. Through exposure. Through light. Yet, what stung most wasn't Daniel's downfall. It was discovering how many people had known and said nothing. Old friends who'd smiled in my face, toasted at my wedding, and later whispered, "We didn't want to get involved." People who chose silence over morality. People who saw my pain as gossip, not warning. But silence doesn't protect the guilty. It only delays their reckoning. So when the reporters started digging, when names and documents surfaced, when the same friends who ignored my calls now texted, "We had no idea," I didn't respond. They didn't deserve explanations. They deserved the distance I gave them. Daniel's world was unraveling faster now. Public contracts frozen, investors gone, a legal investigation announced. His smile, once so sharp and confident, had dulled into a blank stare in every new photo. And for the first time in years, the truth was finally louder than his lies. There's a strange silence that follows collapse. Not an explosion, not chaos, but a slow, almost graceful descent. That's how Daniel's empire fell. Not overnight, but inch by inch, foundation by foundation, until there was nothing left for him to hold on to. At first, it looked like a temporary setback. He told the press everything was fine. He told his board it was a misunderstanding. He told his lawyers he could handle it. But lies, when repeated long enough, start to eat their own. And Daniel's empire, the one built on charm, deceit, and carefully crafted illusions, began to rot from the inside. The first domino fell with the city contracts. A simple notice, pending review. Then another, temporarily suspended. By the end of the week, 3 major projects were halted. Millions locked, payments frozen. I watched from a distance, no longer the broken woman begging for answers, but the quiet observer watching a storm unfold exactly as planned. Every phone call he made, every desperate meeting, every forced smile at reporters, was a man trying to hold back an ocean with bare hands. Then came the audits, deeper, sharper, more aggressive. Emails leaked, internal memos surfaced. Suddenly, journalists had receipts, bank transfers that didn't add up. Subcontractors paid off in cash, fake invoices, ghost employees, and the name Daniel Hale started trending for all the wrong reasons. His partners, once proud to stand beside him, vanished. His lawyer resigned for personal reasons. His PR firm cut ties. Even his most loyal investors, the ones who used to call him the Golden Touch, issued public statements. We were misled. We had no knowledge. We stand with transparency. In reality, they'd known something. They just chose comfort over conscience until the ship started sinking. Then suddenly, they remembered where the lifeboats were. Daniel's world was built on performance, and every act needs an audience. But when the audience leaves, the actor starts talking to himself. And that's exactly what he became, a desperate man giving interviews to defend a crumbling narrative. I remember one clip vividly. A reporter asked, "Mr. Hale, several accounts show transfers to shell companies under your name. Can you explain that?" He smiled, tight-lipped, voice shaking slightly. "Those are fabricated. Competitors are behind this smear campaign." But the reporter didn't blink. She slid a printed document across the table. "This one's from your own accountant's email." He froze. That's when I saw it, the panic. Not in his words, but in his eyes. The moment he realized his empire wasn't being attacked, it was finally telling the truth about itself. Behind closed doors, chaos bloomed. His assistant quit. 2 employees filed lawsuits. The board held an emergency meeting without inviting him. By the time he arrived, security stopped him at the entrance, his ID deactivated, his name removed from the directory. The man who once fired people with a smile was now escorted out of his own building in front of cameras. Not because he was arrested, but because he no longer belonged. And that was the cruelest punishment of all. The world didn't destroy Daniel Hale, it simply stopped believing in him. The same journalists who once praised him wrote headlines like, "The Fall of a False King." The same investors who called him visionary now called him toxic. The same friends who toasted at his parties now crossed the street when they saw him. But it wasn't over. More secrets surfaced, deeper than money. Hidden accounts, private deals under other names, a charity fund that existed only on paper, whispers of manipulated permits, stolen blueprints, even falsified donations. Everything he touched was tangled in lies. And all I could think was, this is what happens when truth decides to stop knocking and start breaking doors. It wasn't joy I felt watching him unravel. It wasn't revenge either. It was peace. Because I finally understood that karma doesn't rush. It arrives precisely when pride is at its highest. By the time Daniel's name hit the national news, his empire was no longer a kingdom. It was a museum of mistakes, open for the world to see. There comes a day when the past stops chasing you, because it's finally standing in front of you begging for mercy. That day was mine. The courtroom was cold, silent, and heavy with curiosity. Reporters filled every seat. Cameras lined the back wall. I sat quietly in the second row, my hair tied back, dressed simply. No diamonds, no expensive perfume, just calm, steady composure. Daniel walked in late. No entourage this time, no assistants, no lawyers flanking his sides, just him, pale and hollow, clutching a stack of papers like they could somehow save him. The man who once smiled for cameras now couldn't meet a single gaze. When the judge entered, everyone rose. When we sat again, the walls seemed to breathe. You could feel the tension, the kind that only exists when the truth is seconds away from becoming permanent. For months, the investigation had grown teeth. My team, my quiet allies, and the evidence we'd gathered had stripped away every lie he'd wrapped himself in. It was no longer about revenge. It was about truth finally walking into the light. The prosecutor began. Each document shown on the screen was a knife of reality. Emails, bank transfers, falsified signatures, hidden assets. Piece by piece, the mask fell. But the moment that changed everything wasn't legal. It was personal. The prosecutor paused and turned toward me. Your Honor, we'd also like to call a witness who was directly affected by Mr. Hale's actions. My heart didn't race. Not anymore. It was steady. Steady like someone who's already lived through the worst pain imaginable. I stood up. Every eye turned to me. Daniel's head lifted, confusion flashing across his face. Then recognition. His lips parted, my name escaped them, soft and broken. Sarah? The silence that followed was absolute. I walked to the stand. The air felt electric, almost unreal. This wasn't the homeless woman he'd left behind. This was the woman he'd tried to erase. I didn't look at him when I spoke. I looked at the judge. My voice was calm, unwavering. He left me with nothing. No money, no home, no explanation. I slept in shelters while he bought a new house the same month. I begged for work while he dined with clients. And when he said I was too emotional to handle finances, he was hiding millions in secret accounts under my name. The courtroom murmured. Daniel's face drained of color. The prosecutor displayed a final document on the screen, one he hadn't seen yet. The inheritance letter. It was from my late aunt, the one he'd told me had nothing left to her name. The one whose estate he'd quietly intercepted, rerouting the funds before I ever knew it existed. 67 million. My name, my bloodline, my future. And he'd buried it all under his own greed. When the evidence was read aloud, Daniel's body stiffened. His jaw trembled. He muttered something under his breath, something between disbelief and fear. That's not possible. I handled that legally, but the documents spoke louder than his denial. And when the judge's gavel struck wood, it sounded like thunder. All assets acquired through fraud are hereby frozen pending full restitution. Mr. Hale, you will face federal charges of embezzlement, falsification, and fraud. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, flashes, and whispers. Reporters scribbled. Phones recorded. But I didn't hear any of it. Because Daniel was looking at me. Not with anger. Not even hate. With something worse, understanding. He finally realized what he had done. And who he had done it to. He whispered almost to himself, "It was you. You set this up." I met his gaze for the first time in years. And with a quiet, steady breath, I said, "No, Daniel." "You did." That was the moment he broke. His eyes watered, his shoulders sank, and for the first time, the great Daniel Hale looked small. Not because of what I'd done, but because of what he'd built his life upon. Lies. As the officers led him out, the cameras followed. He didn't fight. He didn't shout. He just walked, hollow and silent, into the truth he'd spent years hiding from. I stayed in my seat long after everyone left. No celebration, no applause. Just the quiet sound of closure. People talk about revenge like it's fire. But standing there, I realized revenge isn't fire. It's light. It doesn't burn. It reveals, and when truth finally shines, even the darkest souls have nowhere left to hide. That was my judgment day. Not his, mine. Because it was the day I finally forgave myself. Forever loving a man who thought he could bury me. When the storm finally settled, the silence that followed was nothing like the one that haunted me after the divorce. This silence was peaceful, earned, deserved. The kind that comes after the truth has finally burned away the lies. The news had spread everywhere. My ex-husband, the man who once laughed at my pain, was now a cautionary tale in the business world. His empire had collapsed under the weight of his own deceit. The same people who once praised him whispered his name with pity, or worse, disgust, but I didn't smile when I heard it. I didn't dance in the ruins. I just exhaled. Because revenge, no matter how justified, doesn't fill the void. It only closes the wound long enough for you to realize how deep it once went. I spent weeks alone, away from everything, from money, noise, people, just me and my thoughts. I walked along the coast some mornings, the same way I used to before everything fell apart, and I thought about how far I'd come from that night in the shelter. I was no longer the broken woman trembling in the dark. I was someone who rebuilt herself from dust, quietly, fiercely, completely. And yet, as strange as it sounds, I forgave him. Not because he deserved it, but because I did. Holding on to hate felt like dragging the past wherever I went, and I was finally ready to walk free. I used part of my inheritance to start a foundation, one that helped women who'd lost their homes after divorce, women who were told they were nothing without him. Every story reminded me of who I once was, and how far strength can take you when the world gives up on you. People often ask me if it was worth it, the revenge, the exposure, the plan. I tell them this: it wasn't about revenge in the end. It was about truth. Because truth has a way of balancing the scales, slowly, painfully, but perfectly. And if there's one lesson I carry with me, it's this: sometimes losing everything is the only way to find yourself again. The night everything fell apart was also the night something inside me woke up, and it's been awake ever since.